Hi off. So thanks everyone for coming along. And yes, hopefully we'll give you some nice insights. Can you hear me? Is all
Yep,
good?
loud and
Yeah.
clear.
All right, very good. Okay. I should also mention that Ellie did win the experimental physics prize. I think was it last year? So so even though she talks down her credentials, she's actually quite a good experimentalist, I have to say. So, okay, so yep, so you've probably seen me around. I'm Peter Reece, and I'm kind of like the third year lab director and have been for a few years. And so what does that really mean? I kind of look after the labs, work with Tamara and Nicholas, and try and keep, bring online new experiments and also keep old experiments current. So, and in the third term, I also run the Phys 3117 course, which is kind of an elective labs for those who truly love lab deeply. They can go on and do lots more lab and do more complicated experiments, and yeah, so and it's pretty cool. And there's kind of open-ended experiments that we have as well. So yes. All right, so that's me. So basically what I'm going to talk about is the marking rubric, which I kind of helped put together with various people. And I'll also give you a little bit of an overview of the lab as well, just because, it gives you a bit of history, a bit of context. Sometimes you run into things in the lab and you think, they're a bit odd, and they kind of come about from historical reasons. So, so yeah, it's worth knowing a little bit about this. So whoops. So I'll pop in. So one thing that's nice to point out, which the old lab manager Patrick McMillan used to always like to tell me, and all the students says, if you have a look at the university logo, you have the logo which is currently under review, which is kind of Scientia Manu Mente, which actually means knowledge by hand and mind, and I think they're chucking in the heart there.
Yeah, they know
Uh,
it by heart, hand, and mind.
by heart, hand, and mind. Yeah. So, and this kind of like appeals to the university's like tradition as actually being a technical college. So before the 1950s, it used to be kind of Kensington Technical College, and the rah-rah boys across Cleveland Street used to call it Kensington Kindergarten. But anyway, we have a very kind of practical mind or origin, and the lab really kind of pursues the notion that you're learning through your hands. So the experimental lab is there to allow you to kind of work out what's going on. And some theorists, they don't really like experiments, it's just like an annoying aspect to the whole physics endeavor. But some of us actually think that the kind of experimentation is quite important. So yeah, so I put that in, and that's a call actually. And this little photo here is kind of my credentials. So you can see here, as mentioned by Max, I was a oh, I should turn, oh yeah, you can see the pointer, can you? Maybe I have to turn it on.
We can see a mouse.
Oh, you can see it. Okay, cool. Oh yeah, I'll make it the laser pointer because I like lasers. Here I am as a kind of young undergraduate student in the 90s. I've got my band t-shirt on and my black jeans probably underneath there. And then here I am as a smug demonstrator in the photonics lab. Yep, aligning some things which I'm not looking at, which is a bad idea. Anyway, so that was me. So all right, so let's move on. Oh. All right, so I'll give you a bit of lab history. So before 2016, lab was actually, oh, sorry, I'm just having an issue here. Let me go back to automatic. Okay, so lab used to be kind of 2.5 separate entities. Actually, in my day, lab was, there was a kind of a whole floor devoted to second year, a whole floor devoted to third year, and there was a separate photonics laboratory. There were electronics laboratories, and there was even a computational laboratory as well. So they all kind of got merged together after 2016. And here's some kind of photos that I've put on the side, kind of where you can see what the state of experimental physics in the undergraduate lab used to be. So actually, it's much more like what you would find in other universities. So our nice sexing lab in the higher year labs now, is very polished, and we have the Center for Quantum Computing to thank for that, because they basically took over our space and kicked us out. So we had to move into some new digs, and they also bankrolled the refurbishment. So that was nice of them. Anyway, so yeah, so basically, in second year, the kind of old style format was second year was a kind of 3-hour lab session. So it was actually its own subject, and the lab session had to be, you basically did the experiment, you wrote it up, and you had the assessment within those 3 hours. And so the topics varied; they didn't really match with the curriculum. They were just kind of on their own. And actually, some of these relics are are still there that you'll find. So for instance, if you were doing second year electromag, you would have found the magnetic hysteresis experiment that came from this kind of suite of experiments. And my recollection of this was that it was a pretty big sweat to kind of get everything done. You didn't really have time to think about it. You just had to kind of plow through it because you had to kind of write up your lab report. So, it was a kind of pressure cooker environment. Didn't really have time to think about stuff, but and yeah, it was a bit stressful. So anyway, so that was second year. So in third year, actually, second year was a compulsory subject for physics students. In third year, we had kind of a more open kind of lab environment where I think everything was elective. So there was a main lab subject, and then there were a couple of photonics laboratory subjects. And the experiments really ran for between 8 to 12 or plus hours. You were given a whole bunch of material to read, and a list of experiments to do, and you just kind of churn through it over a couple of weeks, and then eventually you did your lab report, and then you got it marked by an academic. So so quite similar to now what we have across the board. So we kind of adopted some aspects of the kind of third year approach and some aspects of the second year approach. So you'll find in second year some of the labs are a bit shorter. You just do them for 3 hours. Whereas in third year in the experimental and computational physics course, you might do a 2-week experiment, and then again they are kind of 4-hour blocks that you get. So anyway, so that's that. So the labs were kind of, so the big change came in 2016, where basically we had to kind of conform to the 6 unit of credit subjects. And so we disbanded the second year lab subjects, and we incorporated a lot of experiments into all of the subjects, right? So that was the idea, that you could have a partner lab that would fit into your course, and so would teach you something about the subject matter in a practical sense. I don't know whether that actually works out as it sounds on paper, but anyway, that's essentially what we have. And then the kind of the third year lab subjects, again, some of them were kind of farmed out to the courses, and then we made this experimental and computational lab, and it incorporated actually a computational physics aspect as well. So there used to be 3 unit of credit electives on comp phys in second and third year. So the idea there was some computational aspect to it, but then there was also some lab component. And then basically we kind of insisted that at least to third year students should do some experimentation as well. So now, so in the past, basically the theory-minded students would ditch lab at the earliest opportunity and then just work on the kind of the theory. And then those students that were theory averse, they would kind of find as maximum amounts of credits that they could do in the lab subjects and avoid some of the pricklier subjects. So anyway, so we kind of got rid of that and kind of smoothed everything over. So yeah, so another thing that's worth mentioning is that so obviously there's a lot of people that have kind of built on these labs over the years. Some of the older students may remember kind of Patrick McMillan, who ran the lab for about 10 years before 2016, and he was involved with the lab for much earlier than that. He was a kind of a passionate educator, but a very chaotic man. And yes, so the lab was, he also didn't like academics very much. I think it would be safe for me to say this. And so, the lab used to be a kind of academic free environment. So I used to run the photonics lab. So I was kind of shuffled downstairs near my research lab, and that was fine. But yeah, but anyway, it actually, excluding the academics, meant that there was a lot of more engagement. The students were comfortable to spend hours and hours in the lab and think about things. But some of the bad aspects of the approach were that you may have ended up in a lab marking session with Patrick for several hours. And I think Lachlan can attest to the fact he may have spent 4 hours doing a marking session with Patrick at some point. So, but anyway, there are also other people. So before them, Barry Perchek, he ran the lab for 25 years, and a lot of the older experiments are still have his kind of fingerprints all over them. And so, and also Tamara obviously is here now, and she's been running the labs and been involved with the second year labs for quite a number of years. And Mike Gow was also an advocate for the laser lab, and you may have met Mike as part of your, he still does some teaching in first year, I think. So, okay. In addition, there was, electronics labs, as I mentioned, and we still have the capabilities of running these labs. We just, so if you ever kind of wanted to push some of the academics to try and run little workshops, there's some very nice electronics kits. And I just would like to share with you a little show and tell. So this is what I found that I made in third year electronics. It's a little electronic dice. Amazingly, it still works. So you can kind of, it's got a little random signal generator. I'm still trying to get that lucky 7, but anyway, it's something that you could use to be able to do in experimental physics. So yeah, so for all those reasons, we had those kind of changes to the curriculum. Again, we're trying to remove, just to give a kind of holistic approach to studying physics. So yeah, so that's a little bit of introduction. So now the lab reports are they're quite a unique assessment, I would say. In fact, once upon a time, I think physics was always assessed via kind of an oral assessment, but with the expanding numbers of students and academics, always like avoiding work, we kind of eliminated that and like appeal to the easier exams. But anyway, so it's still nice that you have the kind of lab being marked by an academic. You get to meet them and find out what they're like. So as Ellie said, they're not really as scary as you might imagine. At least most of them aren't. And yeah, so and it's a good chance to find out about what they do as well. So if you again, the 15 minutes is very short, I would say. Sometimes when I run marking sessions, they can take 30 minutes. I mean, the notion of the marking session is that it should be an extension on your learning. So you should be able to get some information, additional information on top of, or at least reinforce the stuff that you've learned through the experiments. Well, that's how I imagined it should work as well. So yeah. So that's that. So sometimes you'll get an expert, sometimes you won't. Obviously everyone is an expert in their own kind of specialization around here, but sometimes you don't get someone who is like, an expert in, say, magnetic fields. Like for instance, me, I know lots about optics. I know less about kind of integrated electronics. So yeah, so that's that. But you have to remember there's like about 70 individual labs, different types of experiments in the higher year labs. And so you're never going to find that someone has covered all of these things. So yeah, and that's actually a great depth of the, of the lab, that we have so many different experiments. So, yeah, you can learn quite a lot. We try and retain these things and keep them going so that if anyone is ever interested in this, yeah, then you can kind of explore it through, say, Phys 3117, so through the lab elective. So okay, so what's the problem point? So with the lab marking. So it's a kind of point it's one of the only bits in physics where you have some value judgment, which is kind of attached to the work. So all the other assessments are either, oh, you got it right, or you got it wrong, or although, in marking final exams, there's a little bit of gray area as well. But, essentially someone is kind of looking at your work and they're saying, okay, well, have you done a good job? Have you done a bad job? What actually is a good job? What's a bad job? It's tricky. And for some people, it means some things, and others, it means other things. So, and I would like to point out, I just put a little picture of this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which Adam Mikulich recommended, and I can highly recommend reading. It's really fascinating, and it's really about the kind of philosophy of quality and value and things like that. So it's it's scary how relevant it still is, even though it was kind of written in the 1970s. So anyway, so there's that. So okay, so the problem is that, you know, there's some individuals think differently about what, you know, they feel is important in a particular lab, or in labs in general. And, you know, there are differences with the expectations of the students as well as the markers, and, you know, it can be a source of tension. So the idea of the marking rubric is that, you know, we're trying to give a sense of, you know, what is important. It's guidelines for the markers. It's also guidelines for the students as well. So yeah, it's not perfect. I'll be the first to admit it. And we're always thinking about ways of improving things. And actually, if you look at the wording of the marking rubric, I mean, it's actually, you know, I would say to get full marks, you would have to, it's unreasonable the kind of the levels in which the marking rubric kind of sets. But, you know, the good news is that people use it as a guide, but don't stick to it strictly. So, you know, the possibility of getting 20 out of 20 is there, and, you know, people do get them. So, you know, yeah, so, and I'll talk more about that later. So, okay, so as I mentioned before, you should really take the marking sessions as an opportunity to actually learn more about the experiment. So, and also about the whole process. So, you know, if someone said, oh, you know, your error analysis is not terribly good, you know, you can ask them why. You can, you know, within that 15 minutes, if you're, you know, you can get a little bit of information, or that you get some suggestions, then you can kind of pursue those for your subsequent marking sessions. And you'll find that, you know, that your marks will improve if you start to adopt some of the suggestions. I also feel like you shouldn't be afraid to ask questions during the marking sessions. Actually, you know, what we're really looking for is just a good, meaningful scientific conversation. So, you know, that's the best thing. It means that you've thought about the experiments, and you can kind of talk, you know, at a reasonable level that shows that you understand something. So it's much more important. And, you know, asking a question doesn't mean that, oh, well, I didn't understand everything, therefore I'm not going to get 20 out of 20. Well, that's you know, that's not the case at all. In fact, if you have an insightful question, it, you know, it improves your standing over having a picture perfect report. So yeah, so anyway, so that's my little thing about the marking sessions. Okay, so the marking rubric. Okay, so it's I think Patrick and I initially worked on it, and then Adam incorporated it into this. Adam Mikulich incorporated it into the second year, and then it kind of became this document that helped guide markers. And now that we have so many subjects involved with the lab, there's many more markers. So so we kind of try and divided it up into the sections that you know, we felt that was important in terms of you know, what you should be getting out of the lab. Okay, and also, you know, it was an attempt to try and balance out what people's expectations were. So some people would write, like, you know, beautifully worded vacuous reports, very glossy. You know, Ellie talked about latexing up, and you know, her reports, which you know, are fine. Some people like it more of as a kind of written presentation. I think, you know, we're probably moving towards like a mixed format that, you know, if you want to do electronic format, if you wanted to do paper format, either is fine. But the important point was that just having a beautifully written report with no kind of content in it does not warrant getting you 20 out of 20. Equally, if you have a very scratchy report, which, or, you know, lab book that you can't follow what the student is doing, even though the answers might be correct, that's also, you know, doesn't warrant getting 20 out of 20. It's like, you know, you have to kind of balance these things out. And also, we wanted to promote the importance of doing, you know, good error analysis as best as you can. So, you know, so therefore it was kind of pushed up. And then in the end, obviously understanding the topic, even though that, you know, maybe you would argue that should be 100% of the lab, actually, because we're kind of developing the whole scientific, you know, inquiry process. You know, it is an important part, but it's not the whole story. So So yeah, so, and yeah, as I mentioned, the rubric's not perfect. We'd like to have, a more nuanced rubric which matches the individual experiments. There are 70 experiments, so that's quite a bit of work. Sometimes the rubric jars against like the types of things that you're doing in the lab. So, so for instance, yeah, like it might appear that there are no errors in this particular experiment. So why is it worth 20%? Well, of course, uncertainties are always a factor, and it actually comes down to digging a bit to find these things out. So, but, maybe, again, a more nuanced marking rubric might be nice. And it's something that's on the cards. So yeah, so anyway. All right, so lab book quality. So I'll go through the rubric. There are obviously the kind of, whatever, 5 categories. And so I'll just go through and I'll just talk a little bit about each individual point. So if that's fine. Yeah, and if you want to stop me at any point and just ask questions to stop me rambling, make sure I'm not talking to myself, feel free. And Lachlan, if you feel like interjecting at all, that's also fine. All right, okay, so lab quality. All right, so Ellie, as Ellie mentioned, so we're looking for the whole process. Okay, so we want warts and all. So, but obviously not all warts. That would be disgusting. We need to have, we want to see your thought process. We want to see you making mistakes in the labs and correcting things. So, this kind of active, yeah, like process is what you're trying to gather when you're looking at the lab book. So don't be afraid to make mistakes and say, oh, well, these measurements were done in a, incorrectly, or I forgot to turn off the lights, or I forgot to take the background, or people were walking around and so, it fluctuated the ambient conditions. And so that kind of stuff, you can kind of write in there, and it shows the whole process going on. So that's really what we like to think about. So for me, the lab book, it needs to be able to be followed by someone else or by you at some later point in time. So if you imagine yourself in a year or 5 years time, opening up your lab book and you see just unlabeled, tabulated data and some graphs without any labels on them and no aims or anything like that. And of course, you can't be guaranteed that your lab script's going to be available to you, so that you write, oh, the lab script is, explain the experiment, and I just write down the numbers. So obviously that's not going to work. So I really think that anything that is not physically attached to your lab book, if you shake it or electronically shake your lab book and things fall out of it, then you should discard those. They don't actually count for anything. So try and keep it, so it doesn't, as I mentioned, okay, we're looking for kind of the warts in terms of the process, not in terms of the book. But equally well, okay, I should also point out, so the lab book and your report should be your own words, right? So in the end, you might be doing work with a kind of lab partner, but you should, finally just be writing up your own discussion, your own analysis. You might come to different conclusions from your lab partner, but it should always be in the final, work that you submit should be your own work. Yeah, so again, glossy productions, are time consuming. So sometimes they're fine as a way to kind of organize your thing, as long as you're putting in the level of detail that you might normally put into a lab book. But they can hide the thinking process. They can also hide the analysis that you do. So if you're manipulating your data, if you're doing some kind of smoothing or reordering, and you don't put that kind of information into your glossy report, then actually it's very hard for someone to repeat or to follow what you did. So again, like this is a kind of there's a current problem with science, and I think it's actually like a crisis, I would say, and actually it's more kind of focused towards the biological sciences, but there's a big issue about irreproducibility of data, right? So, and you can kind of, there's like whole collections and discussions online, like from that Nature have done and Science have done, about people that like do one, we had an old, well, we still have a gag in my lab, which is one result equals one publication, two results equals no publications. So what it kind of means is that, oh, if you repeat your experiment, then, you know, it's likely to you know, contradict your first experiment. So if you only do one experiment, then it's all fine. So obviously that is ridiculous. But the problem is, you know, experiments get like big and complicated, and like, you know, some experiments take 4 years to set up, and there's only like 2 labs in the world that could reproduce them. And so, you know, you have to be sure that, you know, what you're doing is correct. And all of this kind of concept of the writing up the lab book, writing your things down carefully, you know, so that you can follow them is going to be an important skill for later on in life. So, you know, so that's why the lab book quality is kind of factoring in there. So um so yeah, so some kind of hints and tips. So kind of small details and notice. So, you know, when you're getting your lab report, so if you do simple things like, you know, write page numbers down for the report, or put the date that you did it. You know, if you add titles, I saw in Ellie's report, fabulous, you know, everything was kind of, you know, perfectly labeled, so you could kind of, you know, what's going on, you know, so that's good. Pointless to rewrite the student notes verbatim and into your report. So you might want to cut and paste certain sections if you're making a kind of a paper-based lab book. But, you know, it doesn't really actually show that you understand anything, and it's quite time consuming to do that. So, so you definitely don't want to do that. But do write out the aims in your own words, and because that kind of sets the tone about, you know, what it is that you're, you know, that you think you're trying to achieve. The other thing which is very useful is to add some kind of experimental diagram. Pictures, you know, says 1,000 words, as the old adage goes. And yeah, so you know, so having a nice diagram which has kind of got lots of labels on it with a kind of little description about what it is, perfect. That's the kind of thing that you want to definitely include into your lab book, because you can kind of reference back to it when you're writing up your analysis and things. So okay. All right, so if you have to repeat measurements, you're unhappy with the first set, don't scribble them out. As I said, this is science in action. So this is exactly the kind of things that we want to see. Yeah, so that's the lab book. So sorry, how are we going for time? What's the, can't see the clock. Oh, okay, all right. I will keep going. Okay, so other things, don't write huge tomes of information, okay? Save that for the PhD, because in the end, you've only got 15 minutes, and actually you'll come across quite dissatisfied if you know, your, you know, the lab marker skims over all the things that you've written about and doesn't actually read them in detail. You know, you won't feel like you're getting a good showing. But, you know, in the end, we have these 15-minute slots. I usually go over quite a long way, so people have been irritated in the past because they have to wait for me to catch up to them. So, so yeah, so maybe, but so obviously this is a balance, okay? You want to spend as much time as possible getting good information out of the lab marker, but, you know, you want to keep to 15 minutes. Anyway, okay, the next section is focused around the results and the questions. Okay, so experiments never run smoothly, particularly in the higher year lab. There's always like little sticking points which are not written down in the lab script, and so they're the things that you need to navigate. And usually the marker knows what's you know, what they are if they're a good marker, and so it's how you navigate those sticking points and interpret the results, which makes a good results section, I think. So if there are questions to be answered, usually they're kind of sprinkled out throughout. Like in the second year experiments, they're kind of put up front as part of the pre-work. In the other kind of third year labs, they usually, you know, throughout the lab report, they're usually there to try and help guide what you're supposed to be doing. So definitely have a go at answering the questions, because, you know, that's important as kind of indicated by the marking rubric. Okay, so your actual data should be present, and like this may seem crazy, but, you know, when you do, if you just accept like a LaTeX type report, some people only give you the graphs and they don't give you the other types of information that you need. So so that's a no-no, and that's why having the written lab report can be quite helpful. You know, so if you've done stuff like you know, you've reflected on your data, you know, during the lab, like, you know, maybe did a quick plot and then realize, oh, I need new points around this resonance. So that's the kind of thing that's good. And the more kind of experimental notes or notes that you make during the experiment, the better, because it means that you're not going to forget them when you write up your analysis like later on. So, okay.
Quick question, Peter.
Oh, yes.
Do you think it's worth including the raw data this term when we're all given the same data set?
Yeah, so yeah, generally I'm speaking about, you know, not remotely. So
Oh,
no,
yeah, I know.
I don't think, unless you've done some manipulation, actually some of the data sets are kind of quite big. So, you know, I would say you should write down the details about how you manipulated the data, but you don't have to include the data itself. So yeah, so that's certainly the case. I mean, you'd just be wasting paper. But in general, yeah, like definitely include the data that you've recorded. Yeah, okay.
Cool, thanks.
No worries. Okay, so errors. Okay, proper error analysis can be very time consuming. And actually, the more you dig into it, the more time consuming it becomes. So it can end up being a larger job than actually doing the experiment itself. In some fields, the error is the only important thing. And so I give you an example I had a friend who was studying the variation of the fine structure constant with John Webb studying kind of quasars, spectra, and things like that. And there, obviously, um, obviously fundamental constants don't vary. So, you know, when you do a particular measurement, then and you're using a big telescope that costs kind of $100,000 a night, you know, you get your data, and your answer is very close to zero. So obviously, you know, the constant physical constant should be constant. But the question is how close to they are, how close are they with respect to zero, and how good are your errors in kind of, so that's where the details are. So, you know, if your error bars overlap with zero, then you can say, well, fundamental constant alpha doesn't change. But if they don't, then that's actually a big significant thing. So here's a good example where errors become a very important aspect. In the higher lab, I don't think you're going to, you know, get any Nobel Prizes for discovering these types of things, but, you know, yeah, it's still worth considering errors. So so yeah, so, but, you know, you have to be careful not to go kind of too far along. So yeah, so you should always include a discussion of your errors. So it's always relevant, even if it doesn't look like it should be. So in things like CW NMR, where, you know, a computer does some kind of scan and then it spits out some spectra, and you're supposed to use that spectra, you know, still there are intrinsic errors or uncertainties in the measurement, and it's more difficult to find and do a good job of error analysis of those. So, so yeah, it's nice when you're just plotting something and you're recording, you know, numbers of a you know, an oscilloscope or something. Like the errors are very obvious, but, you know, more challenging when they're kind of hidden. Yeah, so you should handle your errors appropriately. They should be propagated through to your derived results. So that's going to be important. And I guess Michael spent a bit of time on that last week. So no point in going too much further on this. Okay, obviously you need to make the distinction between kind of things that are instrumental errors, that like the random uncertainties, some kind of systematic errors which are going to kind of shift your results systematically and put them off your kind of expected value. And then all these observational errors, which you could also call lab partner errors. Like, for instance, oh, my lab partner did those measurements and he was terrible, and so therefore then they're a bit rubbish. So obviously a good experimentalist will be able to eliminate those kind of observational errors. So if you're appealing to those, then, you know, it may indicate that you haven't done the best possible job with your error analysis. So yeah, but I am generalizing here. So so yeah, so in terms of analysis and discussion, okay, this is where you're supposed to kind of dig into the data and actually the experimental framework that you're doing. So, you know, you're obviously working on a particular model. You know, maybe it's the slowly varying currents model, so or the kind of lumped circuit model if you're analyzing an RLC circuit. And so, you know, not only can you look at your data, but you can look at the assumptions on which you know, how you're analyzing your data. And I think, you know, a really good analysis will, you know, will go more deeply, you know, than just following the recipe, getting the result, and then, you know, ending, right? So, yeah. So asking yourself questions when you're writing these things, or at least using it as a checklist to see, oh, am I actually achieving this? So you wrote some aims out, you know, the aims were given to you, you know, you may have decided on a particular experimental method to find them. Okay, did you make those aims? Didn't you? Why not? So that's all part of the process. Again, that, oh, what would I do differently if I had my time over? You know, yeah, so that kind of stuff is what we want to know. A big thing that I kind of pick on, or, you know, spend time on, is that, you know, your analysis of your results are never complete without some kind of comparison with an expected result. Yeah. So an expected result, you know, might be a reference value that you have, you know, but it may not be given to you. You may have to search out for it. So, you know, some of the measurements that you do, you know, you have no natural feeling for, like, what does this measurement actually mean? I have a value and I have an uncertainty, you know, I have an inductance and it has an error. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that what I expect? You know, so you need to find this kind of information out. So it usually requires looking at the reference material, asking someone, getting some hints and tips, but it's really essential for the analysis. Just kind of finishes off the whole experiment. You know, this is what I got with this uncertainty. You know, is it good? Is it bad? How do I know that? Well, you know, this is what it should be as per this reference. You know, and so if it's outside of the expected or the uncertainty that you have, then you have to have some discussion about, you know, like, what happened? Is it a systematic effect? You know, have you kind of gone outside the range that the model you were working on was valid? You know, that kind of stuff is what you need to be asking. Okay, again, understanding the limitations of the experimental apparatus. Okay, so that's good if you can at that point where you can understand that, you know, or even, like, you know, if it's below the level of noise or the stability of the system, all that stuff is good in analysis and discussion. So, you know, not having a discussion, that's the only, you know, problematic point. So, you know, they're all good discussing points. So again, if you have a particular model that you're working on, okay, are you breaking that model by, you know, driving your experiment into some kind of weird conditions? So that's also, you know, a good discussion point, right? So usually people don't usually do this, but, you know, you can try out things within the framework of the experiment that you're given. Can you do, you know, more measurements, try a different thing, you know, try a different, you know, measurement range? If you have that, describe what you did. That's always worth, like, bonus marks for sure. Did you do some extra reading? Did you go, okay, well, you know, how does this relate to, you know, some particular topic, right? You know, if you're doing the squid experiment, measuring, yes, this kind of superconducting quantum interference device, you know, if you try and then go and understand how squids are used elsewhere, that's also great discussion, right? You know, okay, in the comprehension start, this is the last bit, which is really, have you understood the subject matter? And, like, if you link in what you're doing, particularly in the subjects where there are, you know, you have a course, like a lecture component, and then you have the labs, then, you know, trying to link back to what you learned in lectures is really good. I think that's definitely worthwhile. Sometimes the topics might be completely random, so gamma ray spectroscopy, for instance, or coincidence counting. In that case, you just have to do some background reading, right? So to understand what's going on. Understanding the limitations of the experiment, okay, is also, you know, demonstrate that you understand that they actually have limitations. So that's always good. Okay, I think that's basically it. So, okay, so I have some general tips, which I think Ellie is kind of covered as well. So it's expected that you ask to get some help from your demonstrator, you know, and, like, some people do it and they do it a lot, okay? And actually the demonstrators are the best. That was when I knew the most about the experiments, when I was the demonstrator, and I'm sure Lachlan knows much more about lots of the experiments than I do now. So so they understand about the sticking points and things that you would not be able to find out just by kind of plowing through. So ask the demonstrator, and you can keep harassing them, and they'll know the point where they should stop helping you. So they'll kind of like, yeah. So it doesn't hurt to ask them. Make friends and collaborate. Okay, so it's not what you know, it's who you know. And actually, I'm not very good at making friends and networking with people, but it turns out in my experience, this is the best way to get ahead. And like, learning from other colleagues about how experiments worked, the whole Discord server is great because it involves kind of peer collaboration and stuff. So that's good. So if you're a kind of a shy person like me, you should really try and get out there and like network and like learn more about what's going on. As I mentioned, you have to produce your own work in the end, but there's nothing wrong with drawing on as many resources that you have available to you. Okay, do a little bit of research on the marker. Okay, so so obviously depending on who it is, they may be looking for different things, and so I give some people the names. I'm not calling people names or even associating with any particular person, but there might be the stickler, the person that kind of really wants you to like stick to the script and like make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. There's the enthusiast that will give you a the good mark regardless of what you did. And so obviously there is a subset of people that are they're on your side. And so then there's the expert who you can't kind of like talk your way out of a bad result. There's a theorist who doesn't care much about experiment at all, but will be highly engaged if you talk about the theory surrounding the experiment. And then there's the egotist who like loves to talk about themselves. So so obviously if you can kind of if you understand your marker, then you can kind of maybe improve your chances. Okay, so I also think you should think about what it is that you want to say. I think if you can lead the conversation, you can lead it towards the good parts of your experiment, about the things that you know a lot about, and the marker will go along with you, because in the end, as I mentioned, it's all about having a really interesting scientific conversation. So about the science, and it demonstrates that you understand something. So one big mark booster is about like taking feedback. So if in some things, one of the lab sessions, your marker said, oh, well, you could do this on your error analysis, or, on your report, to, think more about these points, and you do it in the next, lab session, they will remember and they will give you more points. So I think it's very useful. You have to keep it professional. I think it can be stressful. Like I've had situations, I've just kind of marking for God knows how many years now. And, I've had like arguments with people about 1 or 2 marks that have taken longer than the actual marking session, the original marking session. I've had like people getting very upset during marking sessions. I think you've got to keep it in perspective. Like, the lab components can be not worth that much in some of the courses. So yeah, like I think keep it more focused on like as a learning experience, and then you can keep it in perspective. So yes. Okay, and the last little bit, sorry, I probably almost run out of time. Oh okay. Yeah, okay, so so everyone could get like 20 out of 20, like full marks, if they just put in like, an enormous amount of effort. As Ellie indicated, a few hours of work, that's not uncommon for kind of the type of thing that you need to do. It is a game of diminishing returns though. So, so it might be a few hours to get like a 15 or a 16, and another few hours to get a few more marks. And then, to really convince your marker that, you're like all over this particular subject. It's like, yeah. Very, very challenging. So instead of, don't think about doing it for the marks, marks are, on offer, but like really think about it as doing it for the experience of, being able to get in there and get your hands dirty, like playing with equipment that you would otherwise not have access to. So I think that's really useful. And I put here like from some kind of old pictures, if you can kind of see if you can guess who they are. These are yeah, some of the academics that you'll find around from a long time ago. Anyway, that's basically my story. Sorry, I
Can I
realize
just
now
ask, is that Paul Kermy on the right?
it sure is Paul Kermy. How young does he look? He was like,
I haven't seen his beard that full ever, I don't think.
yeah, he was. I think when he was he was a new academic when I was an undergraduate. I didn't realize how young he actually was because when you're 20, everyone that's older than 30 just looks old. But he must have only been a few years out from finishing his PhD when he was at this point. Can anyone guess who the middle person is?
It's Adam Mikulich.
Oh, it sure is Adam. Yeah, exactly. Another child of the, of the 90s with his band t-shirt and his flannelette shirt. So, all right. And to finish off, the person on the left, here, any takers? No? Lachlan, come on.
I think that could be Richard Newbury.
Oh, it is Richard Newbury. Exactly. I know. Anyway, okay. So if you have any other questions, yeah. So
I will
feel
just
free to-
say we're a bit over time at the moment, but I think we have 5 minutes just before we get kicked out the call because that's how long I set it for. So
Oh,
if
okay. All right.
anyone
Yeah,
got some speed questions, we'll try and run through them quickly, I think.
I think that was pretty thorough.
Yeah, I think if no one else has got anything to say, I think it's good to wrap it up here.
Okay.
Oh,
No
we have a question in the chat.
Oh, okay,
Okay. Where is the chat?
I'll read it out to you. So from Noah, what software do you use for error analysis?
What do I use for error analysis? So I usually use MATLAB. You can use Excel. It can take you only so far. It's a question. Okay, in terms of like error analysis, if you're analyzing kind of plotting results and things like that, like obviously something like MATLAB or Python does much better if you're doing nonlinear fits. But just propagating errors through, it's a kind of, you should use what you're familiar with, to take you as far as you need to go. And if what like for instance, Excel doesn't take you all the way, then you need to, use something else. So, yeah, I think that's the best thing. Yeah.
Personally, so I spent a little bit of time early on writing a linear regression algorithm in Python, and then just used that for all of my straight line fits throughout the rest of the experiments.
There you go. That's a bit of time automating, and then yeah, it's pays dividends. So that's good. There are some in MATLAB, there's kind of CF tool, the curve fitting tool, which kind of can work quite nicely. You could spend a whole lot of time talking about error analysis, especially with fitting. It's not at all obvious the kind of assumptions that you make about when you do a nonlinear, where you do a linear regression about the distribution of your errors could actually be completely wrong. So, and it will yield the wrong results. So, yeah, so it's a tricky area, but, worth looking into at some point. Okay.
So no more questions, it looks like. So I'll say a big thanks to both Peter and Ellie today. Very fantastic reports. And I was glad to have you guys on. I think we all learned something very valuable today. So thank you to you two.
Yeah, no worries. And also, if you ever have any questions, you can just drop in or send an email. I'm happy to, also answer things outside of this. And, if you have any unplugged session, then I will add more swearing and, incriminating names. So.
All right. We'll keep an eye out for that. Yep. So I think we're about to get cut off here. So I think we'll call it there. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.